Friedrich Nietzsche is one of the most important philosophers in the tradition of Western thought. He's one of the most artistic and ruthless and fascinating individuals in the intellectual history of the West. He viewed himself as being the end of the Western intellectual tradition. He saw himself as the destroyer of metaphysics. He saw himself as the destroyer of Christianity. He saw himself as a combination philosopher-artist in the tradition of Plato, and he offered a comprehensive critique of the Western intellectual tradition, not conceived merely or narrowly as a philosophical tradition, but as a cultural tradition. Nietzsche, more than anyone else, was a philosopher of culture. He offered criticism of every element in Western culture, and his criticism is noteworthy for its refusal to compromise, for his insistence that we get to the psychological heart of things. What I'd like to talk about in this lecture is Nietzsche's treatment of Christianity and morality, two of the central questions for most philosophers in the Western tradition, and particularly important for Nietzsche because although he is something of a megalomaniac, there's a certain amount of truth to the argument that he is, in fact, the Antichrist. He, in fact, called himself the Antichrist more than once, and he wrote a book called The Antichrist. And what he hoped to do was to get beyond Christianity. He quite literally thought that he was going to supplant Jesus in the Western tradition, which is quite a tall order. Not many people have that sort of ambition. But Nietzsche was never a shrinking violet, and in fact, he wanted to offer a new set of values. He wished to offer a new cultural orientation to the West, or perhaps to revive an old cultural orientation in the West. And he wished to make us confront the half-truths, the lies, the evasions that are characteristic of almost everyone's life and thought. Now, he wrote several books that criticized morality. In some respects, the tradition of Western ethics is his main target. And perhaps the most intriguing of these books, or one of the most intriguing of these books, is called Beyond Good and Evil. Now, getting beyond good and evil is a rather unusual activity for a philosopher, particularly one concerned with morals. But Nietzsche wants to take an extremely skeptical and extremely naturalistic approach to moral theory and moral valuation, and he wishes to offer a criticism of Christianity and the values that it represents, and in addition to supplant that with a new code of morals. Nietzsche asks an important question that everyone living in this modern age, this one-world, anti-metaphysical age, has to confront, which is, where does Christianity and its moral values come from? How is it that human beings conceived of as animals, as featherless bipeds, how is it that they come to have a thing called a conscience? How is it that they make judgments of good and evil, which is not characteristic of fish or birds or reptiles? What is it about human beings which causes them to construct moral systems which are in some respects the antithesis of nature? Why is it that we feel the desire to conflict with nature and make judgments that nature never does? Nietzsche thinks that he finds the answer in the psyche of the human individual, and he thinks that we are very peculiar animals, animals with strange attributes which are which are natural and which are part of the human condition. But in fact, Nietzsche says that most of our elevation of ourselves beyond nature, beyond simple facticity, is a kind of spurious raising of ourselves outside of and above nature. The German term for this is Sonderstellung. What that means is other position, a position somehow outside of nature. Nietzsche wants us to confront the fact that we are animals, that we are part of nature, and that our moral judgments are in fact part of that natural process. In looking at Christianity, Nietzsche goes back to the actual history of Christianity and asks, what is it that Christian morals represent? Whose interests do they serve? And why are these interests disguised? What is it about the moral judgments characteristic of Christianity that needs to be disguised? What is it that, in other words, that's a lie in Christian morals? Remarkable question. Nietzsche's answer is that there are two kinds of morality, and Christianity only represents one particular perspective on judgments of good and evil. And this perspective is the perspective of the herd. Nietzsche contrasts two kinds of morals. Herd morals, morals that are characteristic of the weak, the feeble, the inferior, the enslaved, which is to say Christianity, and master morals, morals of warriors, the predatory human beings who make judgments on the basis of their strength rather than their weakness. Nietzsche wishes to supplant the herd morals characteristic of Christianity, characteristic of Western culture for the previous 2,000 years, with a new morals, morals that harkens back to the age of the Homeric hero, which harkens back to the aristocratic warrior elite, which is found all over the world, which creates values out of nothing, and which glories in the fact that their judgments can be enforced in this world, independent of any metaphysical construct. Now, Nietzsche asks, who was it that created Christianity? Well, it's an outgrowth of Judaism, and Judaism is a priestly religion. Christianity is an extension of that. And Christianity, in its earliest historical phases, appeals to the slave class in Rome. In fact, Christianity is the revolt of the oppressed masses in Rome. And Nietzsche argues that Christianity and its myths was organized so as to articulate the perspective of the slaves, of the inferior, of the feeble. And it was a way of having revenge upon masters, having revenge upon warriors, having revenge upon those who could oppress them, and turning the tables by offering a scale of values that was different from and independent of that of the master class. Nietzsche says that the slaves have their revenge, and the triumph of Christianity in the West amounts to the triumph of the slave, of the inferior, of the weak and impoverished. Think about the ideas or the myths that underlie Christianity. The idea that even in this world, if there's no justice, there's another world, heaven and hell, where God's eternal justice gives everyone what they deserve. Nietzsche says that what this in fact is the frustration, the impotence, the anger of slaves transformed into a myth which allows them to get their revenge on those that oppress them, if not in this world, at least in an unreal world, which offers them some solace in a world of pain and misery. Nietzsche contrasts the morality of Christianity with the morality of the Romans. The Romans were fierce, independent, warlike men who made their own scale of values based upon power, based upon the desire to dominate, and they showed no reluctance to inflict pain on those they viewed as inferior. And here inferior means not morally inferior in the Christian sense, but physically inferior in terms of practical strength. Nietzsche's new alternative to Christianity will be a resuscitation of the warlike values of the ancient world. And what he hopes will come out of this will be an evaluation of Christianity which allows us to get beyond Christianity. And the one who is going to succeed Christ as the central figure in Western moral theory will be Nietzsche himself. He frequently signed himself as the Antichrist or as Dionysus, another incarnation of the Nietzschean judgment of good and evil. And in doing this, he raises very disturbing questions about the kind of moral judgments that we make that are still characteristic of this culture, and the difficulty of maintaining the traditional judgments of good and evil, characteristic of the West, in an age in which religion and theology are taken less and less seriously. Now let's think about the idea of getting beyond good and evil. Nietzsche contrasts the slave and the master moralities, and he says what's characteristic of Christianity is the distinction between good and evil. Good, in the Christian sense, means kindness, lovingness, pity, essentially. Nietzsche thinks that Christian morality is a morality of pity, which raises to a spurious level of distinction, feeling for the weak, the inferior, and the impoverished. We might contrast this with the master morality, which doesn't distinguish between good and evil. In fact, it distinguishes between good and bad, in the sense of capable or incapable, potent or impotent. That's a totally different judgment of value from that characteristic of Christianity. And in fact, this is the scale of values. This master morality is the one which Nietzsche expects will produce the highest type of human being. Nietzsche holds the view, which at least in part is borrowed from Darwin, that human beings have no intrinsic value. If you remember that one of the great breakthroughs, or one of the great contributions of Christianity to the West, is the idea that all souls are equal in the sight of God, and that all people are equally valued on some level, regardless of what their particular skills or capacities are. Well, Nietzsche says that's a mistake. What that is the revenge of those that can't do anything. And Nietzsche says, if we are ever going to produce anything great in this culture, if we are ever going to produce anything significant in this culture, we must get away from the idea that other people really matter. The only elements in the human species which are important are the half-dozen great geniuses in any culture. And he says that Christianity inhibits the development of genius. It inhibits the development of creativity because it is envious. It is a way of mythologizing the envy of those that are incapable, of those that are not, that don't have much in the way of capacity. And Nietzsche says if we are to get beyond that, then we must get beyond this morality of pity. We must get beyond good and evil, back or forward, if you want, to the idea that good and bad are the main standards of our moral judgment. So there will be none of the conscientiousness characteristic of Christianity, none of the worry about heaven and hell, about God's judgment. This good and bad morality, this master morality, will be strictly oriented towards this world. It will not be caught up with the problem of conscience. It will not primarily be concerned with the state of one's soul so much as it will be concerned with the state of one's achievements. Nietzsche's judgment of good and bad, this master morality, is oriented towards doing things. The masters are those that achieve. And this is not necessarily to be taken in a political sense, although it can be taken in a political sense. Master moralities can also be the moralities of the artist. Master moralities can also be the morality of the thinker. But it has to be the kind of thinker or the kind of artist who despises mere mediocrity, who wants to go beyond and formulate something in this world that creates a justification for his entire society. As Nietzsche says in The Use and Abuse of History, mankind can only be judged by its highest examples. The average human being has no value whatever. Now, Nietzsche also inquires into the differences between the warrior aristocrat who generates the master morality and the priest. And the psychology of the priest is of great concern to Nietzsche. Nietzsche believes that the priestly type and the warrior aristocrat are both, in fact, superior kinds of men. One type is the individual, the Nietzschean hero, who's going to adopt the master morality. The most dangerous opponent to the Nietzschean hero, the man who adopts this master morality, is the priest. The priest is the opposite of the warrior type. And Nietzsche believes that the origin of this distinction lies in the human psyche, that psychological differences are what distinguish these two. Now, both the warrior and the priest have different kinds of the will to power. They just express this will to power differently. Nietzsche thinks, in fact, that all human beings can be characterized by their desire to dominate themselves, to dominate their environment, and to dominate other people. This puts Nietzsche squarely in the tradition of the sophists. If you think of Callicles and Gorgias in the Platonic dialogues, he's also in the line of Machiavelli, Sade, all of those people who adopt an atheistic perspective and who believe that human life is caught up with the desire to dominate others and to satisfy one's desires to the maximum extent. Nietzsche supports that idea. Now, the warrior does it in a very straightforward way. The warrior takes what he wants without any qualms of conscience. Conscience is an afterthought, invented at a much later date. The warrior just comes in and does what he does because that is his nature. The strong and the weak is the natural distinction. Good and evil is an anti-natural distinction. And if you think about it, there may be a certain grain of truth in this. Think of it this way. Think of the distinction between hawks and sparrows. Sparrows eat grains or seeds or whatever, and they're inoffensive birds, and there are quite many of them. But in fact, there's nothing better about eating what sparrows eat as compared to what hawks eat. We don't make moral judgments about hawks and say that they ought not to eat sparrows. We just recognize that in nature, different things feed in different ways, and predatory behavior is no worse and no better than any other behavior. Nature just is what it is. Nietzsche wants to force us back into nature. He wants us to reevaluate our disapproval of the human hawks. In fact, Nietzsche thinks that we have no more right to judge a warrior or an aristocrat evil than we have a right to judge a hawk evil. And he in fact thinks it doesn't make any more sense. The world of nature, red in fang and claw, just is what it is. And as Nietzsche puts it in a beautiful passage, he says, there are no moral phenomena. There are only moral interpretations of phenomena. A very profound idea. Well, whose values are built into Christianity? The values of the herd, the values of the weak, and that's why it caught on among the underclass in Rome. And the entire history of Western ethics has been extrapolations from this herd morality, which has inhibited the development of our culture. If we were to go beyond that, we would have to allow for the fact that cruelty may not be an evil, that pity may be a vice, that the desire to dominate other people may be the highest expression of human being rather than its worst example. And in that respect, Nietzsche is not only connected to Machiavelli and to Sade and to the Sophists, but if any of you are familiar with the work of Dostoevsky, particularly something like Crime and Punishment, the idea of the singular man, the man that's going to stand outside of good and evil. Remember Raskolnikov commits that murder? Much the same issues are being discussed in that novel. The question of whether, in fact, moral judgment is universal, or whether it's an arbitrary series of conventions designed by the weak to oppress the strong, strangely enough. Now, in a book called The Genealogy of Morals, he tries to figure out how it is we got into this predicament, how it is we came to the point where the inferior and the weak could start to make our moral judgments. And he says, first of all, that the initial moral judgments that human beings made came from the warrior aristocrats who imposed their will on the world. This is not only his model of the warrior aristocrat, it's also in some respects his model of the artist. Think about, and his arguments are very interesting. Nietzsche was a philologist and a professor of classical languages, and he derives most of his arguments from an inquiry into Latin and German words and what their origins might have been. Now, since I can't presuppose that you know Latin and German, let's try English just to see if, in fact, there's some evidence for this, and I think there is. Think about what a noble action is. What makes an action noble? Well, we know that a noble action is a good one. I mean, if you look it up in the dictionary, you'll find that it's a term of approval. Is it coincidental that nobility is also a section of the social structure in ancient societies? Consider the distinction between a noble action and a base action. Who do you think the base are? The base are, in fact, the inferior, the weak, those that take orders rather than give them. The distinction between noble and base suggests that maybe our judgments of value at the time when these words were coined are in fact simply the judgments of important warriors contrasted with the judgments of people that have to suffer and put up with them. Consider the distinction between being mean and being noble. Well, being mean is a very bad thing nowadays, to be mean, but there was a time when to be mean meant that you were essentially a villain. Villain means peasant in its origins. Give that some thought. Nietzsche has a very profound argument here. Think about something like coming from a good family and coming from a bad family. Yes, indeed. Again, the judgments of power, characteristic of predatory warrior aristocrats, were the actual source, according to Nietzsche, of our judgments of good and evil. To be mean, to be base, to be a villain meant that you were bad. to be noble, to be high-minded as opposed to low-minded, to have high moral standards as opposed to low moral standards, ask yourself where they came from. Nietzsche was the first man to force himself to consider the possibility that what we take to be universal moral distinctions applicable to everyone are in fact a disguised form of the will to power, a way for the weak and the impotent to get back at the superior by changing these aristocratic valuations, by moving from good and bad to good and evil. In other words, the invention of evil was a way for the oppressed to strike back at the superior. Nietzsche wants to erase that. He says that's a mistake in Western culture. That's it's a hole or a gap or an inferior part of the Western tradition. And if we want to produce superior human beings, then we have to free them from the shackles of slave morality. We have to prevent them from being undermined in their achievements or undermined in their aspirations by creating in them the conscience, a conscience which prevents them from achieving what they could.